The throne room of the Talic Empire's flagship gleamed with polished metal and strange crystals. Queen Nera sat upon her elevated throne, her body covered in iridescent scales that shifted colors with her mood. Currently, they pulsed deep purple, the color of royal boredom. 6 eyes, arranged in a perfect hexagon on her face, blinked methodically as she studied the human prisoners brought before her. "So these are the creatures causing such trouble," she said, her voice carrying a musical quality despite her harsh words. Her long fingers, each ending in a sharp crystalline claw, tapped rhythmically against her armrest. The humans stood defiantly, though they appeared small beside the towering Talic guards. Admiral Park, leader of the captured diplomatic vessel, looked up at the alien queen without fear. Nera leaned forward, her crown of metallic spines catching the light. "Your species has an impressive reputation. 3 Talic battle groups have failed to establish dominance in your sector. Unusual. We are not easily conquered," Admiral Park replied simply. The queen's scales rippled with amusement. "And yet here you stand, captured when your ship strayed too close to our territory. A diplomatic mission, as we explained to your commanders." Nera rose from her throne, her height nearly twice that of the humans. She descended the steps with fluid grace, circling the prisoners like a predator. 57 species have fallen to the Talic Empire. 57 worlds now serve as our resource planets, military outposts, or pleasure retreats. She stalked directly before Admiral Park. "Earth would make a fine addition to my collection." Park maintained steady eye contact despite the Queen's intimidating presence. "We would prefer to discuss peaceful cooperation." "You bore me, Admiral Park," Nera said, her scales briefly flashing red. "Your species talks of peace while preparing for war. It's all so predictable." The human admiral remained calm. "We prefer cooperation to conquest, Your Majesty." A slow smile spread across Nera's face, revealing rows of gleaming teeth arranged in concentric circles. The sight caused several crew members to step back, but Park held his ground. "Perhaps we should settle this differently," the Queen said, returning to her throne with a dramatic sweep of her robes. "A competition of 5 challenges between our peoples. If you win, Earth remains untouched. If I win, your world becomes the prize of my collection." Murmurs swept through the Talic court. Such a proposal was unprecedented. "And why would we agree to games when our freedom is at stake?" Park asked. "Because I already have your ship, Admiral," Nera said, leaning forward. "I could simply take Earth now." Her claws extended slightly. "I'm offering you a chance. Isn't that what humans always desire?" The Admiral turned to confer briefly with his crew. Officer Jin, the ship's tactical expert, whispered urgently, "This could buy Earth time to prepare defenses." Medical Officer Han added, "We might learn about their weaknesses." Communications Specialist Ba looked concerned. "Or we could lose everything on games we don't understand." Park nodded thoughtfully before turning back to face the Queen. "What kind of challenges do you propose?" Queen Nera's scales shimmered with delight. 5 tests: strategy, innovation, cultural understanding, diplomacy, and finally, combat. Each side will select their best representatives. "And the rules?" Park asked. "Will be fair and agreed upon by both sides before each challenge," Nera replied. "I may enjoy conquest, Admiral, but I abhor cheating. Victory means nothing if not earned." Park considered the situation carefully. Earth's military stood little chance against the full might of the Talic Empire. Intelligence reports suggested they controlled nearly a quarter of the known galaxy. Yet something about the Queen's manner suggested she truly wanted this competition, perhaps needed it. Behind him, his crew exchanged worried glances. Lieutenant Kang, normally stoic, looked particularly concerned. Ensign Du nervously adjusted her uniform. They had all heard stories of planets that had fallen to the Talic, the resources stripped, populations enslaved. "We accept," Park finally declared, his voice firm. The Queen's court erupted in shocked whispers. Many of the Talic nobles appeared outraged, their scales flashing warning colors. Nera silenced them with a raised hand, her expression triumphant. Excellent. The first challenge will commence tomorrow. Until then, you will be given comfortable quarters. She gestured to her guards. Escort our guests to the diplomatic section. As the humans were led away, a tall, thin Talic with pale green scales approached the throne. Jim, the Queen's chief advisor, bowed deeply before speaking. My Queen, this is unprecedented. The humans are unpredictable. Why risk? Because conquest without challenge has grown tiresome, she interrupted, her scales now pulsing with excited blues and purples. Every victory comes too easily. Every species surrenders too quickly. She rose from her throne, walking to the massive viewport that showed the stars beyond. I want something different, Jim. But the court is concerned. Some say this makes you appear weak. Nera turned sharply, her scales briefly flashing dangerous crimson. Do they? Perhaps they would prefer to challenge me directly. Jim bowed lower. Of course not, Your Majesty. But these humans, what if they should win? The Queen laughed, a sound like crystal chimes. Besides, what could these primitive beings possibly teach the mighty Talic Empire? She turned back to the stars. Prepare the announcement to be broadcast throughout our territories. I want everyone to witness this spectacle. In their new quarters, Admiral Park gazed out at the same stars, though through a smaller viewport. The accommodations were surprisingly comfortable, with adjustments made for human biology. Do you think we have a chance? Officer Jin asked, joining him. Park watched as a Talic battleship glided past, its size dwarfing their captured vessel. I don't know, but Queen Nera wants entertainment more than conquest right now. That gives us an opening. She underestimates us, Jin observed. Yes, Park agreed with a slight smile. And that will be her first mistake. The grand arena aboard the Talic Imperial vessel had been transformed overnight. What was once a space for military training now hosted a complex holographic battle simulation system. Hundreds of Talic nobles filled the viewing platforms, their scales glittering under the bright lights. On screens throughout the Empire, billions more watched with interest. Admiral Park entered with his selected team. Tactical Officer Jin, Weapons Specialist Min, and Navigation Expert Sun. They approached the simulation controls with caution, studying the unfamiliar interface. Queen Nera arrived to thunderous applause, her scales shifting through royal purples and golds. 4 elite Talic commanders flanked her, each bearing battle scars that told of centuries of conquest. The first challenge tests strategic thinking, Nara announced, her voice amplified throughout the arena. Each team will command a fleet in simulated space combat. Standard galactic rules apply. No actual bloodshed, but total victory conditions must be met. The human team huddled together, quickly discussing approach. They've set the simulation in an asteroid field, Officer Min observed. That limits movement patterns. Jin nodded. And the Talic ships are larger than ours, less maneuverable. We could use that, Admiral Park suggested. Hit-and-run tactics might work. The simulation began with both fleets positioned at opposite ends of the virtual battlefield. The human team moved cautiously, splitting their forces into smaller, more agile groups. They darted between asteroids, using the natural cover to shield their approach. Queen Nera watched with mild amusement. She casually flicked her clawed fingers across the control panel, ordering her fleet into a standard Talic formation. The spear point, famous across the galaxy for its unstoppable forward momentum. As the human ships attempted to flank the Talic formation, Nera suddenly altered her strategy. Her fleet split into precisely coordinated groups, each targeting a human squadron. Within minutes, she had divided the human forces and systematically eliminated them. The simulation ended with a complete Talic victory. Not a single human ship remained on the holographic battlefield. The arena erupted in cheers as Nera stood, scales glowing with satisfaction. One victory for the Talic, she announced to the galactic audience. As expected, Admiral Park accepted the defeat with dignity. "We underestimated your tactical experience, Your Majesty." "A common mistake," Nera replied. "I've been winning battles since your ancestors were drawing on cave walls, Admiral." The next day, the second challenge was announced: technological innovation. Each team had 3 days to create a new communication device, using only the limited resources provided. Officer Song, the human engineering specialist, led this effort. The humans were given a workshop space with basic tools and components, many unfamiliar to them. "These power cells operate on principles I've never seen," Song said, examining a glowing crystal. "But I think I understand the basic function." For 3 days, the humans worked tirelessly. They tested, failed, reconfigured, and tested again. Song barely slept, her fingers constantly in motion as she connected delicate components. In the Talic workshop, their engineers worked with practiced efficiency, their movements precise and methodical. They followed established Talic design principles, improving on existing technologies with incremental enhancements. Queen Nera visited both workshops daily, watching the different approaches with interest. She lingered longer each time in the human workshop, fascinated by their unorthodox methods. "They connect components in ways we would never consider," she told Jim during one such visit. "It shouldn't work, and yet." On the final day, both teams presented their creations before a panel of Talic judges. The Talic engineers displayed a sleek, efficient device that improved transmission speed by 30%, a significant but expected advancement. When Officer Song stepped forward, she held what appeared to be a crude, almost primitive-looking device. The Talic audience murmured with disapproval. "Our communication system doesn't just transmit words or data," Song explained, her voice steady despite the intimidating audience. "It conveys emotional context across vast distances." She demonstrated by having Admiral Park speak into the device while standing at the far end of the arena. His words came through clearly on the receiver, but remarkably, subtle vibrations and color shifts in the output conveyed his confidence and determination. "We studied Talic scale patterns," Song explained. "Your species communicates emotion through color changes naturally. Our device translates emotional states across species barriers, allowing for true understanding, not just word exchange." The Talic judges conferred in hushed tones. Finally, the head judge stood. "The human solution is unexpected. It addresses a problem we had not considered." He paused. "The point is awarded to the humans." A shocked silence fell over the arena, broken only by the excited whispers of the human team. Queen Nera's scales flickered briefly with surprise before settling into a pattern of curious blue. Later, in her private chambers, Nera reviewed recordings of the human device. "Fascinating approach," she told Jim, who stood stiffly by the door. "They solve problems differently than we do. They considered communication barriers we take for granted." "They got lucky," Jim replied, his scales showing patterns of concern. "But the court is concerned, my queen. Your interest in these humans seems excessive. Some whisper that you deliberately chose challenges where they might excel." Nera dismissed him with a wave of her hand. "The competition continues. 2 more challenges before the final combat test. That is where Talic superiority will be indisputable." As Jim departed, Nera returned to studying the human design. Something about their approach nagged at her. A creativity the Talic Empire had perhaps lost during its centuries of unchallenged dominance. Meanwhile, in a secluded chamber deep within the Imperial vessel, several high-ranking Talic gathered in secret. Commander Lee, his battle-scarred scales darkened to avoid detection, addressed the group. "The Queen risks our standing in the galaxy with these games," he said, voice low. "The subject worlds are watching. Already there are reports of increased resistance on frontier planets. They see the mighty Talic playing games with primitive beings rather than crushing them." "What do you suggest?" asked Naval Director Yan, her scales pulsing with anxious patterns. Lee leaned forward, eyes narrowed. Perhaps it's time for new leadership, one that remembers the true Talic way. The gathered nobles exchanged glances, their scales shifting to colors of conspiracy and ambition. The next challenge, Lee continued, may provide our opportunity. Be ready. The grand ceremonial hall of the Talic flagship glowed with ceremonial fire pits. The flames cast dancing shadows across the gathered assembly of nobles, military leaders, and now, human visitors. Queen Nera sat upon a mobile throne at the hall's center, her scales rippling with anticipation. The third challenge tests cultural understanding and adaptation, she announced. Both sides will demonstrate their ability to learn and perform traditions not their own. Nervous whispers spread through the human delegation. Cultural rituals were often the most difficult aspect of alien relations, filled with hidden meanings and ancient symbolism that outsiders rarely grasped. Each team has had 2 days to study the other's customs, Nera continued. The Talic team will perform human greeting customs, meal practices, and a cultural dance. The human team will perform the ritual of ascendance, the water offering, and the oath of stars. Admiral Park glanced worriedly at Cultural Specialist Officer Kim, who would lead the human demonstrations. The ritual of ascendance has 17 distinct movements, he whispered. Are you certain you've mastered them? Kim nodded confidently. I've been studying nonstop. What concerns me is that the Talic assigned us their 3 most sacred ceremonies. They expect us to fail. The challenge began with 4 Talic officers attempting human customs. Their first task was a simple handshake greeting. The Talic approached this with stiff formality, their clawed hands gripping the humans too tightly, causing visible winces. Their attempts at casual conversation were equally awkward, filled with inappropriate questions about reproductive habits and life expectancy. When attempting a human meal, they struggled with utensils designed for 5-fingered hands, spilling food and breaking several plates. Their attempt at a traditional Korean folk dance ended with 2 officers tangled in each other's limbs after misinterpreting the movement patterns. The Talic audience watched with growing discomfort. Many had never seen members of the superior race appear so clumsy and undignified. Queen Nera observed silently, her scales shifting through thoughtful patterns of blue and green. Then came the human's turn. Officer Kim stepped forward for the ritual of ascendance, traditionally performed when young Talic reached maturity. The complex ceremony involved precise movements that symbolized the rise from primitive origins to cosmic dominance. Kim began slowly, his movements careful but fluid. He followed the ritual's 17 traditional positions with surprising accuracy. The Talic audience watched with increasing interest as the human body, so different from theirs, nevertheless captured the essence of each symbolic pose. Then, at the ritual's climax, where the performer typically mimicked rising to the stars, Kim added something unexpected. Instead of reaching upward alone, as was traditional, he extended one hand toward his fellow humans and one toward the Talic audience. The gesture clearly symbolized mutual ascension rather than solitary domination. A shocked silence fell over the hall. Then, remarkably, several elder Talic began a low humming sound, a traditional sign of deep approval. Kim proceeded through the water offering and oath of stars with similar skill, adding subtle variations that honored the original meaning while suggesting cooperation rather than conquest. When the demonstrations concluded, the Talic judges conferred briefly before announcing their decision. The point is awarded to the humans, the head judge declared. Their performance showed not only technical proficiency but deeper understanding of ceremonial purpose. The human team exchanged relieved smiles while the failed Talic performers stood with scales dulled in embarrassment. After the formal proceedings, Queen Nera approached Officer Kim privately. Her guards maintained a careful distance, but close enough to protect their sovereign. How did you understand the symbolic meaning so quickly? Nera asked, her scales showing genuine curiosity. The ritual of ascendance dates back 15,000 years. Most non-Talic find its subtleties impenetrable. Kim bowed slightly, respecting Talic custom. We study your historical records. Adaptation is humanity's greatest strength. We observed how the ritual evolved from a primitive hunting ceremony into a cosmic statement as your species developed space travel, and the variation you added at the climactic moment. Kim met her gaze steadily. I hope to honor your tradition, while showing how humans might interpret its meaning. Was it offensive? Quite the opposite, Nara replied, her scales shifting to a shade rarely seen by outsiders, a deep violet that signified thoughtful reconsideration. It was illuminating. Later, Nara watched recordings of the challenge in her private chambers. She paid particular attention to her officers' struggling attempts at human customs, their rigid movements, their obvious discomfort with unfamiliar practices. Perhaps the Talic Empire has grown too rigid, she murmured to herself, not realizing her advisor Jim had entered quietly. My queen, he questioned, startling her. Our officers failed at simple human greetings, she said, gesturing to the screen. Tasks children could master, yet the humans adapted to our most sacred ceremonies with ease. They are an unusual species, Jim conceded reluctantly, but surely not worth this continued fascination. The court grows increasingly concerned about your investment in these games. Nara's scales flashed warning colors. The court should concern itself with its own duties. The competition continues as planned. After Jim departed, Nara returned to studying the human performances, particularly Kim's variations. For the first time in centuries, she felt something unexpected, doubt about Talic's superiority. In the guest quarters, the human team celebrated their victory. Your performance was brilliant, Admiral Park told Kim. Where did you learn to move like that? I studied thousands of hours of Talic ceremonial recordings, Kim explained. But honestly, I think they've forgotten what their own rituals truly mean. They perform them by rote now, without understanding. That gives us an advantage, Officer Jin suggested. Perhaps, Park replied thoughtfully. But I'm more concerned about the reaction among the Talic leadership. Did you notice Commander Lee during the ceremony? His scales were practically black with anger. Meanwhile, in a secured maintenance shaft far from surveillance, Commander Lee addressed 20 high-ranking Talic conspirators. Their numbers had grown significantly since the second challenge. You've all seen it, Lee growled, his scales pulsing angry red. The Queen's fascination with humans weakens us. Today we witnessed Talic officers humiliated while primitive aliens modify our sacred rituals, and our Queen awarded them victory. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. The subjugated worlds are watching closely, continued Naval Director Yan. Reports indicate increased resistance activities on 3 frontier planets. They sense weakness. And what of our allies? Asked General Tak. The Vorm Confederacy has already requested clarification about our new approach to expansion. Lee's 6 eyes narrowed. We must act before it's too late. The 4th challenge is diplomatic negotiation. The perfect opportunity. While the Queen is distracted by her games, we will secure key systems and communication hubs. And the Queen herself? Someone asked from the back. Lee's scales shifted to a cold, determined pattern. She will be given the opportunity to return to traditional Talic ways. If she refuses, he left the sentence unfinished, but everyone understood. As the conspirators dispersed, none noticed the small maintenance drone hovering silently in a shadowed corner, its recording light blinking steadily. The diplomatic hall had been transformed for the 4th challenge. 3 raised platforms held representatives from subjugated species of the Talic Empire, the crystal-skinned Vorus, the 4-armed Pylori, and the telepathic Nist. Their delegations watched with wary eyes as both teams prepared their approaches. The 4th challenge tests diplomatic skill, Queen Nara announced. Each team will create a trade agreement involving these 3 species. The representatives themselves will judge which proposal best serves their interests. Diplomat Choi stepped forward as the human team leader. With her calm demeanor and measured speech, she had been the natural choice for this challenge. We request time to consult with each delegation separately before presenting our proposal, Choi said. The Talic team, led by Ambassador Ju, scoffed. Unnecessary. We already understand our subjects' needs. Queen Nera's scales flickered with interest. Both approaches are permitted. You have 4 hours. The Talic team immediately retreated to prepare their proposal, while the human team approached the Vorus delegation first. We wish to understand your specific concerns, Choi said, bowing in the crystalline manner of Vorus respect. The Vorus representative's faceted surface rippled with surprise. No one has asked for our input in 3 centuries. For the next hour, Choi listened intently as the Vorus described their planet's mineral shortages. She then moved to the Pelori, learning of their agricultural challenges, and finally to the NIST, who sought educational resources for their young. Meanwhile, Admiral Park noticed increased activity among the Talic guards. They seemed tense, their scale patterns showing alertness colors. He quietly instructed Officer Jin to monitor ship communications. When the preparation time ended, Ambassador Ju presented the Talic proposal first. He outlined a standard imperial trade arrangement, resources flowing primarily to central Talic worlds, with regulated distributions to subject planets based on productivity quotas. This system has maintained imperial prosperity for millennia, Ju concluded confidently. When Diplomat Choi rose to speak, a small data pad in her hand blinked with an urgent message from Jin. Fleet Heat Movements, DETCTE. Maintaining her composure, Choi began. Our proposal creates a triangular trade system. The Vorus will provide crystal technology to the Pelori, who will supply food to the NIST, who will offer educational services to the Vorus. She displayed a holographic model showing resource flows between all 3 worlds. Each species contributes what they excel at and receives what they most need. The representatives leaned forward with obvious interest. Additionally, Choi continued, we propose reduced taxation from the Central Empire for all 3 worlds, with the savings invested in local infrastructure. Before the representatives could respond, the diplomatic hall's doors slammed open. Commander Lee entered with a squad of heavily armed guards, their weapons raised. This farce ends now, Lee declared, his scales pulsing aggressive red. Queen Nera rose from her throne. Explain yourself, Commander. Talic warships have surrounded the royal palace, Lee announced, his voice echoing through the hall's communication system. Queen Nera has been corrupted by human influence. For the preservation of Talic dominance, I am assuming control. The hall erupted in chaos. The subject species representatives huddled in fear, while Talic nobles scrambled to declare loyalties. Arrest the queen and the humans, Lee ordered his guards. The games are over. As guards advanced toward the throne, Admiral Park made a split-second decision. He lunged forward, grabbing Queen Nera's arm. This way, he urged. We have an escape route. To everyone's surprise, Nera didn't resist. She followed Park toward a service entrance, while Officer Jin and Diplomat Choi engaged the first wave of guards, buying crucial seconds. Why would you help me? Nara demanded as they fled through narrow service corridors designed for maintenance drones. Behind them, alarms blared throughout the palace. Because humans don't abandon allies, even unexpected ones, Park replied, pulling her down a side passage as guards thundered past their position. I am not your ally, Nara hissed, though she continued following him. I was going to conquer your world. Maybe, Park acknowledged, checking a small device Officer Song had prepared. But right now, we both want to survive this scoop. They reached a maintenance bay where the rest of the human team waited with a small transport vessel. How did you prepare this? Nara asked, scales shifting to colors of confusion. We've been planning escape options since day one, Officer Min explained, helping them aboard. Standard procedure when surrounded by potentially hostile forces. As the small vessel detached from the palace and slipped into the asteroid field surrounding the Talic homeworld, communication systems throughout the Empire broadcast Commander Lee's message on all frequencies. The Talic Empire returns to its true path today, Lee proclaimed. Queen Nera's weakness ends now. All worlds will reaffirm their loyalty or face immediate military response. But something unexpected was happening across the empire. The transmission of the interrupted diplomatic challenge had reached dozens of subjugated worlds. They had witnessed the human proposal, the first time in generations anyone had considered their actual needs. On the mineral-rich world of Vorus Prime, the planetary governor faced a crowd outside the imperial compound. "We demand the human trade proposal be implemented." Their crystalline voices resonated in unison. Similar scenes unfolded on Pelori worlds, where agricultural workers downed tools, and across NIST colonies, where telepathic links spread word of resistance faster than imperial communications could counter. Aboard the escaping vessel, Officer Jin monitored imperial channels. "It's spreading," she reported with amazement. "Multiple systems are rejecting Commander Lee's authority." "This doesn't make sense," Nera said, her scales showing patterns no human could read. "These worlds have been under Talic control for centuries. Why would they risk destruction now?" "Hope is contagious," Diplomat Choi suggested quietly. "Sometimes people just need to see an alternative is possible." Nera moved to the vessel's viewport, watching as her palace, the seat of her power, grew smaller in the distance. Talic warships were already firing on each other as Lee's forces clashed with officers still loyal to the Queen. "Where can we go?" she finally asked, turning to Admiral Park. "Lee controls the main fleet. We've made contact with a Pelori resistance cell," Park replied. "They've offered sanctuary while we develop a counter-strategy." "You trust the Pelori?" Nera asked incredulously. "After how the Empire has treated them." "Sometimes trust is necessary for survival," Park said. "Maybe that's another lesson humans can offer the mighty Talic Empire." As their vessel accelerated away from the Talic homeworld, reports continued to flood in of spreading rebellion. A once unshakable empire began to fracture, not primarily from external force, but from internal revelation. The simple discovery that cooperation might yield more than conquest. In the ship's communication center, the three representatives who had witnessed the diplomatic challenge were broadcasting continuous messages to their homeworlds, spreading a dangerous new idea: freedom through unity. The view screen in the command center showed another Talic system declaring independence. This time, it was the Mavis sector, home to major shipyards and 3 resource-rich planets. Admiral Park watched as Queen Nera's scales shifted to a dull gray, a color he had learned indicated deep distress. "That makes 17 systems in 3 days," Officer Jin reported quietly. The human diplomatic vessel, reunited with its crew after the escape from the palace, had become an unlikely headquarters for what remained of Nera's loyalists. The ship hovered near the borders of Pelori space, protected by a small fleet of rebel vessels. "Commander Lee's forces are stretched too thin," Tactical Officer Min noted, studying battle reports. "He's trying to put down rebellions on too many fronts simultaneously." Nera stood motionless before the view screen, her tall frame somehow diminished. The ornate crown still sat upon her head, a gleaming reminder of power rapidly slipping away. "We should set course for Earth," Admiral Park announced. "The Talic Civil War has created a window for humanity to prepare defenses, but more importantly, to offer diplomatic alternatives." Nera turned to face him, her 6 eyes blinking in sequence. "You would take me to your homeworld, after everything." "As a guest, not a prisoner," Park clarified. "Earth's leadership wants to meet the Queen who chose games over conquest." 2 weeks later, the human vessel entered Earth's solar system. Nara spent hours at the viewport, studying the blue planet with scientific curiosity. "It's smaller than I imagined," she remarked to Diplomat Choi, who had become her frequent companion. "Yet your species has accomplished much." "We had to," Choi replied. "Limited resources forced us to cooperate, despite our differences." On Earth, Nera was provided comfortable quarters adapted to her biology. She carried herself with regal dignity despite being far from her throne, her crown still perfectly positioned upon her head. It was the only possession she'd managed to keep during their escape. Reports from across the galaxy continued to arrive. The Talic Empire, once the dominant force in known space, was collapsing faster than anyone had predicted. Commander Lee held the homeworld and core systems, but dozens of formerly subjugated planets had declared independence. More surprisingly, many were forming cooperative alliances with each other. The trade proposal Diplomat Choi had presented during the interrupted Fourth Challenge had spread as a template for new relationships. 1 month after their arrival on Earth, Admiral Park visited Nera's quarters. He found her reviewing galactic news, her scales a muted blue. "Everything I built. Gone," she said without turning. "Not gone," he corrected, sitting across from her. "Transformed. The Galactic Cooperative is forming, with every species having equal representation, including the Talic." Nera's scales flickered with surprise. "Many would exclude us after centuries of domination." "That would only continue the cycle," Park replied. "Humans have learned through our own bloody history that reconciliation works better than revenge." Nera touched her crown thoughtfully. "Lee still controls our military. His support weakens daily. The latest reports show 3 of his top generals have defected to join the cooperative." Park leaned forward. "They're asking for leadership, someone who understands both the old ways and the need for change. You suggest I should return. As what? A powerless figurehead? As someone who has seen alternatives to conquest? Someone who chose games over war?" Park smiled slightly. "Someone who learned from losing." 3 months later, representatives from 27 formerly independent or subjugated species gathered on neutral territory, a space station orbiting an uninhabited world. The first official meeting of the Galactic Cooperative Council was about to begin. Nera entered the chamber last, her tall figure drawing all eyes. Her scales gleamed with healthy color, shifting through subtle patterns that reflected calm determination. The crown still sat upon her head, but she carried herself differently now, not with imperial arrogance, but with measured dignity. The room fell silent as she approached the speaker's platform. Many representatives watched with wary eyes, former subjects seeing their one-time empress in a new context. "I stand before you not as queen of the Talic Empire," she began, her voice clear and strong. "That empire no longer exists as we knew it. I speak today as cultural ambassador for the Talic people." She surveyed the diverse assembly: crystalline Voris, 4-armed Pylori, telepathic Nist, humans, and dozens more species that had either suffered under or feared Talic domination. "For millennia, I believed power came from dominance," she continued, "from conquest and control. I measured my success by territories claimed and species subjugated." Her scales shifted to a deep, reflective blue that many in the audience had never seen on a Talic before. "The humans taught me that true strength comes from cooperation. Through their challenges, through their willingness to understand rather than simply overcome, they revealed the fragility of power based on fear." She touched her crown gently. "My empire is lost, but perhaps something better can be built in its place. The Talic still have much to offer: technology, knowledge, protection. But now we offer these as equals, not conquerors." With ceremonial grace, Nera removed her crown, the last symbol of her former glory. She descended from the platform and walked to a display case that had been prepared at the chamber center. "This represents our past," she said, placing the crown in the case. "Now let us look toward our future." The assembly rose in applause, hesitant at first, then growing stronger. As representatives from dozens of worlds celebrated this symbolic moment, Nera met Admiral Park's gaze across the chamber. His small nod conveyed understanding of what this gesture cost her. Yet in her scale patterns, he recognized something he hadn't seen before: a color pattern that Officer Kim had once described as the Talic expression of liberation. For the first time since losing her throne, Nera felt truly free. The weight of empire had been replaced by something lighter yet somehow stronger: possibility. Later, as the council began its first official session, Nera took her seat among the representatives, no larger or more prominent than any other. The former queen who had once commanded fleets that blackened skies now listened carefully to the concerns of a small agricultural world. Commander Tak, one of Li's former generals who had defected to the cooperative, approached her during a recess. Many Taliks still resist this new arrangement, he warned, his scales showing concern. They see your transformation as weakness. They see what I once saw, Nera replied calmly. In time, they may learn as I did. And if they don't? Nera looked toward the human delegation, where Admiral Park was deep in conversation with representatives from 3 different species. Then they will discover what I discovered. That adaptation is more powerful than domination. Her scales rippled with what might have been amusement. After all, I only suggested a game. Look what came of it. The crown sat motionless in its display case, already looking like an artifact from a distant era. Future visitors to what would become the Galactic Museum would read its description. Crown of the Last Talik Emperor, the game that changed the galaxy. The end.